It is not a new thing for superpowers in this world to try to influence events beyond their border, even try to fix an election to go the way they would like it to go. Now that you know what you know, why do you think the Chinese government has attempted to interfere in our politics? To what end?
Well, I think in our case, and I've said this a few times, we drifted far off the track of our allies under Mr. Trudeau on everything from Huawei in our 5G infrastructure to talking about the repression and the genocide towards the Uyghur minority Muslim population in China, situation with Hong Kong, eventually the two Michaels, the Winnipeg lab. Our allies viewed Canada as being kind of out of step with the West on China. And I was advocating a course correction to be much more like our allies, like the United States, like the United Kingdom. And I think if they had a preference, they didn't want to see that approach. So I think a lot of this misinformation and some of the foreign influence was done to keep status quo in Canada. They didn't like the foreign agent registry that Kenny Chu from our caucus was bringing up. They didn't like our motion. We were one of the first, I think the first parliament in the world to declare the genocide towards the Uyghur population in China after the US Congress. So I think that's probably why. And we had concerns about this before the election, and then certainly during the election, it became a huge problem for us.
The current Prime Minister's father famously opened this country to China before the United States did, 4 years before the United States did. Do you think I'm not sure what the question is here, but do you think the Chinese just kind of like the Trudeau family going way back?
You know, I don't want to engage in any of that speculation. I think some of the stuff about the Trudeau Foundation and all this stuff has really been noise. It's really the concerns I had, Steve, started off when Mr. Trudeau approved the transaction with ONET Communications, for example, and the sale of Hytera. These were Canadian security businesses that the Harper government refused one of these transactions with a Chinese company because we're integrated with the United States on defense and security. So these companies had contracts with the Pentagon. And the people in the Pentagon and the State Department of the US freaked out when Mr. Trudeau reversed the position the Harper government had taken. So there was as David Mulroney, the former ambassador, said, a naive approach the Prime Minister has had on China, perhaps because of the connection his family has. And in this world, this sort of deglobalization world of changing international norms, you can't have a naive view, and you can't be out of lockstep, particularly with the United States. So I think it's really a naivete with the Prime Minister's government, and he set the tone, and his circle set the tone, and I think that's what's gotten us into this position.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, and might make this the last question on this, but I appreciate that you say that the election didn't turn on this. However, after the last election results were in, you were deposed by your caucus, and part of the reason you were was because you had not improved on the seat count from the previous election. If you were able, because the Chinese interference was somehow found out about and therefore neutralized, if you were able to win a dozen more seats, maybe you'd still be the leader? Do you ever think that way?
I try not to. In fact, I'm here to apologize, Steve, because I came on your show and promised that I'd be the leader of the Conservative Party a year from now. So I lied to you indirectly.
Not knowingly.
Not knowingly. Look, you had mentioned MTV, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, certainly picking up seats in Richmond, seats like Bob Soroya in the GTA here, would have been helpful for me to have a better standing. Look, the trucker convoy, the vaccine mandate, those were the real forces that led to my caucus going a different way. And you know what? I supported the Reform Act. I worked with Michael Chong on it, and Pierre Poilievre, who was our Democratic Institutions Minister. So I have to support the will of the people and the will of my caucus, and I do. And I think Pierre will make a good Prime Minister. The issue with the inquiry is I want all of these questions to be looked at. What seats were affected? What groups, whether they're Tibetans, whether they're Uyghur, Canadians of Uyghur extraction, they deserve all of these things to be reviewed. And with the leaks to the Globe and Mail, Steve, what was CSIS saying and how did the government respond? Mr. Trudeau is testifying this week alongside Mr. Blair and others. It's a lack of action, it's a lack of seriousness that I think we have to look at in phase one. And in phase 2 of Justice Hoag's inquiry, we're going to look at ways we can fix nominations, we can trace money better to make sure that there's no 19 ridings or whatever that may have been influenced in the past. So how can we make our system better? It'll never be perfect. It'll never be a complete block of foreign interference, but how can we minimize it and make sure no Canadian is intimidated to exercise their franchise?
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk about, I want to take you back now. I want to take you back to your final speech as a member of Parliament in the House of Commons, which you delivered last June. And you talked about our country needing, I think your words were, a great national purpose. Do you see us having one at the moment?
I don't, actually. And in fact, when I speak to ambassadors from other countries, they're almost waiting for Canada to return to the stage. Because whether it was with Churchill that called Canada the linchpin between Europe and the United States, the Americans, or whether it was Canada's work in NATO, it was the 75th of NATO just last week, Article 2 in the NATO Charter that promotes prosperity and collaboration beyond just defense and security, that was known as the Canadian article, Steve, because of the work done by Louis Saint Laurent, Lester B. Pearson. We were always a leader of the middle powers and invited to the big table because of our alliance with the US in NORAD. So these privileges we have to be at the G7, we're not the 7th largest economy that some people think we are. Mm-hmm. We're there because in the past we've played a role. But if you look at AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US alliance, the Quad, the growing Indo-Pacific, we're not even invited to the meeting, Steve. I also think there's a lot of things we could be doing on human rights, on Indigenous engagement and reconciliation that other countries could take some learnings from, on mental health, and on a whole range of issues where locally we show a lot of initiative, but we don't take that national role and we don't take it internationally. So I think there's a bit of a void right now on the world stage that Canada could fill.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.